Hello and welcome to this Dragon course. This is Grandmaster Jacek Stopa from Poland, and in this course we will be discussing in 16 chapters the Dragon from the black side. It's meant to be a course on the attacking Dragon. Basically, the approach is that black we're gonna try to look for some initiative whenever possible. The course has 16 chapters. We start with some sidelines, and then we will be making our way to the main lines later on. So let's start with the move bishop e2. So bishop e4 c5, knight f3 d6, d4 takes, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, and g6, bishop e2, bishop g7, castles, castles. And here is the first two moves on move 8 that we consider. In the second part, in chapter 2, there will be some more options for white that we will take a look at. So let's start with the move knight b3, knight c6, rook e1. And here there's two options. I will mainly recommend the move bishop e6, but also a6 deserves attention, is quite a playable option. h3, and again, two choices for black. Both are very much in the spirit of this opening. b5 is one move, so black is trying to gain some space on the queen side, and prepares moves like b4, a5, mainly to weaken the center for white. So b4 is threatening then with the idea of knight captures e4, and b5 also makes bishop b7 possible option. If a4, then b4 is more of a strategically accurate response. If ba4, rook a4, and this could be problematic because of this pawn outstanding here on a6 that could be targeted later on. And basically it's the pawn island principle. Basically it's kind of a potential long-term weakness. There's b4, knight d5. Actually, in this particular case, knight e4 is a mistake because of bishop f3. Let's say if f5, then captures rook e4. And knight f6, then of course the piece falls here, and black is losing. So knight d5, ed5, and knight a5. Knight d4, then bishop b7. This is just up a pawn for black. And this position is also roughly equal. Black has a lot of pressure here on the queen side connected with this advanced pawn, and the standard pressure on the diagonal with the bishop. Then later perhaps bishop b5, bishop b7 targeting the d5 pawn, or bishop f5. And the e7 pawn is also kind of weakened here. Okay, so this could be a problem for black. Actually, this is gonna be a recurring theme. White will, in a lot of variations, try to target this pawn, let's say with bishop g5 or bishop f3. But so black will have to kind of make sure that the pawn is well defended or gain enough counterplay. But in this particular case, there will be this kind of a counterplay. And rook e8 is the other option. So this kind of anticipates that white will try to execute his main plan, and that is coming with the knight to d5 and creating some more pressure. So the rook is here ahead of time and will be defending the e7 pawn. Bishop f1, b5, so again this standard move. a4, b4, and knight d5. So very similar position to the previous one, except now white has removed the bishop from e2 to already, not only defend the pawn, but prepare the rook to target e7. And if knight d7, knight d7 is one option, but mainly, okay, knight d5. If queen d5, then queen c7. And then later the bishop will be able to come to e6, get the queen out of here. And again, black will be doing quite well with these two bishops giving a lot of pressure to white on the queen side. So ed5, then knight a5, knight d4 and bishop b7. So this is just the position up a pawn here. If rook e4, then we trade on b3, cb, and a5. Bishop b5 and bishop d7 equal position. So essentially, there's this kind of a weakness on e7, but white's pawn structure is compromised on the queen side. The bishop has great pressure on the pawn, and there's also the c-file. So yes, roughly basically equal position. There's also no way to easily target this pawn for white. And like I said earlier, the main option here is the move bishop e6, bishop f3, knight e5, and now knight d5. So we'll be seeing a lot of versions of this move. Knight d5 captures rook e8, bishop g5, bishop d5, ed, and queen d7. So again, black will be able to develop his initiative on a5, a4, and b5, or get the rook out here to the c-file. And white will be trying to put some pressure on the e7 pawn. That is not basically the pawn is again now in a situation where it's not too weak, and it's not that easy for white to really get to the pawn. There's also knight d5 right away, then knight e4. So basically here white cannot do that right away. And bishop f1 is the most topical move here. That's the usual positioning for the bishop. White will be defending this pawn, and also not putting the bishop in danger here to the knight e5, knight f3 idea. So bishop, this is basically, it's just a kind of a most seen setup here in this line, as white prepares the usual knight d5 and bishop g5. a5, then a4, and d5. d5 in a lot of cases will be equalizing, kind of just clearing the center, and black will be able to obtain this, basically a lot of activity, as we'll see in this example and in some future examples here. Knight c5, then d4 is basically a dubious move here, but queen b6 is quite interesting, although this is kind of a dynamic way to catch a counterplay, as black is able to target the f2 pawn, and then there's checkmate threatening, so white doesn't have time for knight d5 because of this checkmate idea here. But the most natural DE also equalizes knight e6 fe, knight e4, takes, and actually black here, because white cannot really take on e4 right away. If he does, then there's just these problems here with rook d1, with winning position. The problem here is that basically black ends up grabbing the first rank, and the position is just very, very strong. There's no easy way for white to get out of here. And rook c8 is another example. Knight b5, bishop takes, cb, and knight b4, threatening the fork. And so white has to play a move like rook e2, b5, ed, and knight fd5 with equal position. And bishop c4 is dubious, as black has this direct play with knight e4. Now bishop f7 is a mistake. And d4 here with big advantage. Rook e4 is the other option, then d5, takes queen d5. And in this position, again, there is no problems for black, so there's better structure. Black has also control of this open file, possibly coming to c2, and white doesn't really have much in return. If knight d5 then captures, and knight b4. Now if c4 then knight d7, bishop g5, rook e8, queen b2, and knight e5. So now this structure is similar to a lot of setups in the Najdorf. Black is controlling the dark squares and also creating some direct threats on this c4 pawn. So even though white has the pair of bishops, so this bishop is not that active, and after basically this bishop has opened up its control here of this long diagonal. Rook c1, knight a2, rook c2, and queen b6. But this position also is quite okay for black. Is yet another very typical position in the dragon. And if c3, then knight bd5. So white cannot really play this move here. So that was the move knight b3, and now we are off to the main to move bishop g5. I have tried this move with white actually several times, and basically, it's just another way to try to maybe play a move like f4, bishop f3, king h1, and knight d5, and potentially target this e7 pawn. Knight c6, then knight captures, b takes c6, and queen d2, queen b6, then rook a b1, rook b8, king h1, and bishop a6, bishop e3, queen b7, captures. So basically the key is that this move, knight takes c6, is just not very strategically sound for white, as this b7 pawn going to c6 usually favors black, in that it controls this central square d5. So it helps to maybe create some kind of a very active pawn formation like e5, d5 later on, and also, mainly prevents the knight from coming to d5. a5 is another option. I guess a bit more aggressive here. Rook a d1, then a4, e5, then knight d5. So this is a trick that is kind of a tactical trick. That's very useful, and it's quite important to be aware of this sort of a trick. Let's say ed queen d6, knight d5, c takes d5. If c3, then e6. And of course, black is perfectly fine with such very strong center. Then possibly going into moves like a3. And if knight d5, then cd. ed6, queen d6. So again, I guess c3 would transition, and then e6 move would be played. Bishop f3, then e6. c4, rook b8. Bishop f4, then bishop e5. Takes with equal position. And if queen d5, then bishop e6. Queen e4, then bishop takes e5. Again, with a very good position for black. So these pawns will be a liability for white. And, they're just easy to target here. And also black has a very strong center. So I don't think there's any tactical tricks. Queen e5 sacrifice won't work that well. And here after takes, rook takes, bishop e7. There's probably just rook d2, and black remains up in exchange with a very comfortable position. So knight b3, this is the main approach. And I'd say this is the main position here. Okay, a6, then a4, bishop e6. This is one possible approach, but I think this bishop e6 is a better choice. So this prepares d5. Also, in some cases, a5, a4 will be possible here, and it's just the most typical move here in the Dragon. So basically, in a lot of cases, when this move is possible, then usually it's a good move. Also, there's some possibilities for knight e5, knight c4, or bishop c4 later on. And here we consider quite a few options for white. Let's start with the move rook b1. This deserves attention here. Okay, rook c8, rook e1. So white just kind of develops the pieces actively. a6, bishop f1, rook e8, knight d5. So another basically a position where white tries to execute this standard plan. Bishop d5, ed5, knight e5, c3, queen d7. Now if f4, then knight c4 is already better for black. Let's say g3, then knight back to b6, targeting the d5 pawn. And if bishop takes c4, then rook c4. There we have a game here, Kartikeyan Chidambaran, 2018. Knight d2, rook a4 with a big advantage. Queen b3, knight h5. f5 and rook g4 with a very good position for black. And if g3, then queen g4, and knight fg4 with equal position. So this is kind of a middle game / end game kind of version of the Dragon. Black is threatening directly the move knight f3, so there's no way for white to play a move like f4, trying to get this pawn. And black will be getting this bishop out of here, and then, playing a move like knight c4 to create some pressure on the queen side. But the position is roughly balanced. Of course, white has pluses here as well, such as this standard e-file pressure. And queen b2, then b5 is one possibility. So this is basically a kind of a tactical option here. It just works out because even though there's the pawn seems like it's falling, just kind of black is able to tactically make this position work anyway. So let's say knight d5 is a mistake. Now bishop b2. This is an advantage for black. If bishop d5, ed, this particular is not so great. I think the knight has to move away now. Yes. So bishop b2 here is very important. And if ed5, then bishop takes c3, queen c3, and queen d5. Okay, d1, queen e5. Takes. Rook e1 takes, ab, and rook fd8. So this another equal position. Maybe the bishop is better than the knight, but these pawns are doubled, and it's not easy for white to get any kind of advantage. And knight d4 with equal position. And if rook c8, and rook a d1, a6, h3, then b5, a3, bishop c4, bishop takes bc, and bc4, knight d4, knight d4, queen d4, then and queen a5 with equal position. So it can be quite useful for black to have this pawn on c4. Creates a lot of control. Let's say black will be later able to reroute the rooks here on the onto the b file, targeting the b2 pawn. And the bishop is also hanging here immediately. It's difficult for black to maneuver this position. I mean, for white to maneuver this position into some kind of an edge. The usual counterplay here on this e7 pawn is not easy to obtain, and black will be able to use this bishop, let's say with moves like knight d7, later knight c5 or knight e5. And a5 is the other way to play this position, later playing maybe a move like a4. So in the dragon, often in these sidelines, black is trying to weaken this diagonal a4, a3. Let's say if a4 now, and now there's a blitz game between Carlsen and Firouzja in 2021. Knight b4, which is not the most accurate. Knight d4, basically white got an advantage here. Then he should have played f4, queen b6, and king h1 with a slight advantage. So basically white is threatening the move e5, and black is a little bit too slow with the counterplay. And if queen b6, possibly bishop b5, knight e5, then later going knight with the knight to c4, bishop e3, queen c7, f3 and rook fd8. And if knight d5, then bishop takes, and knight b4 with a interesting counterplay. So basically it's double attack now. Black is trying to capture on d5 or and also target the c2 pawn. d5, this we have already seen. And so here another option on move 10 is the move king h1. Also very typical. White is anticipating some play here on this diagonal in the case that f4 and f5 happen. The idea here is the move f4. We'll see also what happens after f4 right away. King h1, then knight a5, f4, rook c8, f5, and bishop c4, bishop d3 and b5, queen e2, then b4, knight a5, bishop takes, and queen a5. So here black again gets equality, although it may look a little bit dangerous here, but there's enough counterplay because even though there's maybe some awkwardness here in this piece placement, black is able to target the c2 pawn and get sufficient counterplay. Ef, f3, and hg. Queen c2 with equal position. And if knight d4, then bishop c4. If b3 captures on e2, knight d2. So here again, there's no major problems. So it's kind of a confused play here for white not to use this f4 idea, and black just comes back here. Rook c8 with equal position. Rook a1 and rook e8. f4 a6, queen e3, queen a5. f4, rook c8, bishop c4, and bishop d3, b5. Queen e2, b4 with very good counterplay. And that leaves us with the move 10 f4 and rook e1. So let's say f4. Here actually this allows this very interesting move b5 exclamation mark. Let's say knight b5 and then knight e4. And if bishop b5, then queen b6. So this is basically why white usually just goes king h1 before playing f4. Queen b6 check, attacking this bishop. King h1, knight e4, and queen b5. With a good position for black. So there's a pair of bishops. White didn't get the counterplay on the e7 pawn. And so this bishop looks a little bit out of play, and there's also targeting of this b2 pawn. Bishop f3, then knight d7, remaneuvers. Rook b1, then a5. Knight takes b5, queen b6. Knight d4, takes, bishop d4. So this works out great for black. And if king h1, then simply a4, knight d2, and knight d4. f5, g takes f5. So there's exchange sacrifice, but okay, we can already tell there's just a lot of activity that black gets here in return. And bishop e7 and rook e8, bishop d6, bishop c2, queen h5, and knight f6, queen g5, h6 with a big advantage, so black will be able to recapture here the exchange on b1, and just it remains with a lot of extra activity. And now off to the main move here, and that is rook e1. Then we proceed with rook c8. So now, of course, there is no b5, as black won't be able to use this diagonal. White will simply recapture with the bishop. Rook c8, h3, a6, bishop f1, knight d7, rook b1 and b5, knight d5, knight b6, c3. And now one interesting move is f5. And the other one is rook e8. So let's say if f5, then takes, ef, and bishop f5. Rook c1, rook f7, bishop e3, queen b7. So this is a kind of an exotic setup. Black, basically f5 is not often seen in the Dragon as a counterplay move. Perhaps it's more of a Greenfield idea. So here, but these creative options, of course, exist as well. Maybe for a player who is trying to badly win this kind of a variation. So here there is a lot of piece activity, but maybe in the long run, this structure can prove to be weak. I personally wouldn't play this particular setup. I think it's not easy for black to develop the usual queenside counterplay against these pawns. And if rook e8, bishop e3, I think this is more of a recommendable setup. Okay, knight c4, captures bc and knight d4, takes, knight e5, with the outpost on d3, and there's a pretty good play here. Let's say queen a4 and queen d7, queen a6, then rook a8. And here actually black gets really kind of a dream position of the dragon. There's attack on this b2 pawn, and also the d3 square is weak, and white is very far from being able to target the e7 pawn. Queen d7, knight d7 also with equal position. So compared to the endgame we just saw a little bit, we just saw earlier, now maybe black is not as active here on the queen side, and the d5 pawn will likely have some problems. I don't think this is a major liability. Black also always has this king f8 or bishop f6. It's just maybe not that easy for white to get to this pawn. Bishop g5, then knight b6. So we're directly challenging this knight from d5, not giving white a chance again to develop pressure against this pawn. Bishop f1, h6, bishop f6, bishop f6, knight d5, and bishop b2. So, and this again is quite good for black. I think basically it's just up a pawn and pair of bishops, this big advantage. But of course, this bishop f6 is just not really something that white wants to do here. Bishop e3, knight g4, bishop f4, then g5, bishop g3. Now a6 is one option. Also knight g5, possibly rerouting the knight to c4. And bishop takes c3, bc, knight ce5, h3, then knight f6 with an unclear position. So a little bit of an atypical setup here for black. Okay, even though this bishop is off the board, black gets great counterplay against these weaknesses here on the c-file. And if bishop f4, and there's two approaches, this d5 is again quite strong, and we get to the topical game here. But also knight e5 deserves attention. Queen d2, king h7, knight d5, bishop takes, knight c4, and here again black gets very good counterplay. So the usual reasons apply here. This pressure on e7 is maybe not as strong as white would want, and black gets the counterplay on the c-file. Queen c7, c3, and rook e4. Queen d3, queen c4, takes. f3, king g8, bishop d4, and king f8 with equal position. And b5, now we get to a game by Nakamura with black, ed5 and knight d5, clearing the center and opening this bishop here, targeting the b2 pawn. So this basically equalizes right away. c3, e5, bishop g3, f5, f3, bishop f7, queen d8, rook fd8, bishop b5, rook d5, bishop c4, rook d7, and equal position here. So white is not going into this ending because the pawn is defended, and he would play against pair of bishops, basically with quite a good position for black, but also a bishop f7, then king f7, and again black is totally fine. The king is gonna be quite good on f7, maybe later progressing into e6. Black will probably use a resource like b6 to guard the knight away from c5, and perhaps then double up with the rooks and control the d-file. Bishop e3, b6, queen c1, and then queen h4, f3, rook fd8, bishop f2, queen f6, knight d2, queen d6, knight e4, then queen e7. Again, a roughly equal position. Black has no weaknesses, but neither does white. Maybe, okay, black has a little bit of a space advantage. And the game was actually won by black, but maybe here, I mean, it's not just, it's not because of the opening. The player with white misplayed. Later on, we're not going to see the whole game, but let's just kind of see how black obtained this advantage here. So, of course, the most natural plan here is to expand on the king side. That's a little bit atypical for the dragon, but actually this position is kind of maybe not the most typical for this opening. King h7, queen e3, f5, knight d2, queen f7, b3, h5 with the idea bishop h6, rook d7. So kind of a self-playing position, easy to play. Black gets the space and is able to slowly maybe build initiative. Queen e1, rook cd8, bishop h4, then rook c8, bishop c4, bishop h6, controlling the diagonal, so it gets a little bit uncomfortable here for white. Bishop d5, rook d5, rook b1, g5, and g4, gf3 with a slight advantage for black. So again, black ended up winning this game. We don't have to see the whole thing actually in this course. The main idea is really to kind of focus on the opening details and overview of the main ideas. So just to kind of quickly recap, we saw two possibilities here for white. That was knight b3 and bishop g5. And there we basically saw just how to typically set up the pieces here for black, get counterplay. Usually that counterplay happens on the queen side, and that's the case in all of the dragon. In many of these sidelines, again, white tries to obtain play against the e7 pawn. That's maybe connected with knight d5, takes, and ed. So basically targeting e7, and black tries to dynamically, with the pressure on the queen side, maybe open the bishop and just get enough play against the queen side. So thank you, and we will be off for the next chapter in a little bit.